But here we go. This is Monday, March 21st, and it's the third of five sessions looking at the wisdom in the book of James. If you've not been to any so far, we'll get you caught up with James chapter 3. If you want to see recordings of the first and or second sessions, I have links to those. If you just want to email me at the Westminster email address, I can get those to you as well. No guarantees on the quality of the recording, but nevertheless, it's there. Couple of quick announcements. One is, I mentioned in an email today, I'm planning to go back to a hybrid format next week for the next 2 weeks, which simply means I'll be in almost certainly the garden room at Westminster for people who want to attend in person. We'll still follow the policies, which right now are masks for indoor spaces. People who want to connect via Zoom, of course, can still do that. I imagine it'll be probably the minority of the group, probably fewer than half, who will want to be in person. But we've got room for that, and we'll try that out. But I'll keep sending Zoom links, and I'll send more information about that when I have it. I'm also planning to do another series after Easter, another 5-week series looking at themes of abundant life in the gospel according to John, which should be a nice way to spend 5 Mondays during the Easter season. So you'll see information about that in the coming weeks. I'll send an email around to this group. It'll be 1 Monday in April and then 4 Mondays in the month of May, which suddenly sounds close by, which is a little crazy how quickly time seems to be going right now. Last announcement then is I'm going to put in the chat a link here, which will give you, if you click on that, it should open up a new window, which will give you the text of James chapter 3, a little bit down the page, and up the top will be the discussion questions for tonight, in case you want to have those for your own reference, but I'll also repost those at the end. That's it for announcements. We can start now. So unless there's any announcements for the good, seeing none, we'll move forward. So James chapter 3. Last week was a little bit thick with the back and forth about questions of faith and works, and what James is trying to guard against, the way in which James is so deeply concerned about favoritism, especially favoritism that favors the rich and privileged and ignores or denigrates those who are lower status or suffering from poverty. And that's a big deal for James. You get a sense that the stakes are really high. In chapter 3, the topic changes quite a bit, and it's I think a little bit less dense of an argument. But I'll share my screen here, put this up, and give you a chance to see texts as well. So in the third chapter of James, we get pretty much 2 presentations, 2 short discussions. On the whole, the main point in James continues to be what I said last week, which is also, I think, a main point in chapter 2, which is the book of James seems driven by a conviction that there's really incredible power in how people of faith conduct themselves publicly, which again doesn't mean that private faith is unimportant or not powerful, but rather James has an eye on ways in which communities of faith can do a lot to discredit their faith or discredit the gospel, but conversely can do a lot to affect change in the world and really manifest or reflect the values of the gospel. And I think that theme continues this week, really through, like I said, 2 main presentations. One is James is going to talk about speech, or the tongue is the metaphor that gets used here, about human speech, about what happens when we communicate, and how there's a tremendous potential for good in that, but also tremendous potential for destruction. And then the final 6 verses in the chapter are a comparison of 2 kinds of wisdom, the wisdom from God that makes for peace, contrasted with a different kind of wisdom that James associates with the world or the earth, which is more competitive, a bit more of a zero-sum game. So we'll look at those 2 different presentations in sequence. One of the things that we'll see, I think, this is maybe kind of a sub point underneath, there's incredible power in how people of faith conduct themselves publicly, that there's also power in how each of us perceives the world, describes the world, and navigates our way in the world. I think when James talks about both speech and wisdom, one of the things that James is doing, one of the things the book is doing, is talking about the importance of pretty much how we perceive or how we sum up other people, our own environment, how we live, where we live, what values we have to live by. So far I've been doing different agricultural or gardening images or metaphors to start off, and there are a lot of those in James. So this idea of a harvest of righteousness being sown in peace for those who make for peace. James has this, I think, a continual reminder with all of the harsh language, which all of the ways in which James seems to be saying, you should be doing more, you should be trying harder, or you should be making fewer mistakes. James nevertheless has this undercurrent, I think, of this idea that it's God's implanted word, that the word that God implants in our hearts is the thing that bears fruit. And similar that in peacemaking, God is the one who sows this harvest of righteousness within us. So to get started with chapter 3 in particular, of course, I want to go back and start with chapter 1. This is what happens when you spend time with a biblical scholar. We always want to set things into a wider context. But if you were here 2 weeks ago, chapter 1 had really a wide array of different themes that all get thrown out there, just kind of get put out on the table at the very beginning of the letter, and then James will sort through a lot of those themes in the rest of the letter. One of the things that James says in chapter 1 is about speech. And so 2 different verses from that opening chapter by way of reminder. James said, "You must understand this, my beloved. Let everyone be quick to listen, so slow to speak, and slow to anger." And then towards the end of the first chapter, "If any think they are religious and do not bridle their tongues, but deceive their hearts, their religion is worthless." And that term that gets translated religion here has a sense of less about beliefs or doctrine and more about our religious practices, the things that we do as religious people, the rituals, the worship that we engage in. So James is counseling early on this a way of listening, that listening should be our priority over speaking. There's some concerns there about speech, especially unbridled speech, and the ways in which that can discredit our religious practices or undermine, I think is maybe a better way of putting it, our religious practices. So chapter 3 now, James will return to this notion of speech and the tongue. As James does that, James is using some imagery and is saying some things about speech and the virtues of not talking too much that are really familiar in other wisdom literature. In other words, in other Jewish writings, we see conversation about not being too quick to say too much. We also see that in wider Greek philosophy and even some Roman philosophy, that one of the virtues that certain philosophers tried to instill in people was a reluctance to be too talkative, says the guy who's teaching here. But here's a quote from a Jewish text from the book of Sirach, which is technically not a biblical text, at least not for Protestants or for most Jews, but is nevertheless a Jewish text from just a couple of centuries prior to the time of Jesus and of James. But just to notice some of the language here in this piece of Jewish literature. Be quick to hear, but deliberate in answering. If you know what to say, answer your neighbor. But if not, put your hand over your mouth. Honor and dishonor come from speaking, and the tongue of mortals may be their downfall. Don't be called double-tongued, and don't lay traps with your tongue. For shame comes to the thief and severe condemnation to the double-tongued. Just notice that term there, right? Somebody who's hypocritical in what they say and how they act. In great and small matters, cause no harm, and don't become an enemy instead of a friend. For a bad name incurs shame and reproach, so it is with the double-tongued sinner. Now, in some ways, this sounds like kind of good old-fashioned wisdom that parents would pass along to children in kind of a, be seen but not heard type of vein. Um, it's advice, it's moral instruction that I think, at least, well, depending upon where you come from in your own culture, is not always handed down in the same way. In other words, different people are sometimes counseled to stay quiet while other people are counseled to speak out. I probably don't need to tell anybody here. Often, of course, young girls in school settings are told to be more quiet in classrooms than young boys are, and the way that gets reinforced in a lot of our school systems is problematic. Hopefully, we're trying to root some of that out in the way in which society becomes more attentive to that. So I'm putting this text up here, acknowledging that this kind of instruction is sometimes deeply gendered, or other ways in which it isn't applied equally. But what I want you just to notice is the way in which, again, James is trafficking in, or James is drawing upon certain kinds of instruction that would have been probably familiar to a lot of first century audiences. Well, what does that look like when James says it, or what does James have to say in particular? James says this, now finally, starting chapter 3. Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers and sisters, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness. James is here probably talking about teachers within the church, as opposed to like a school teacher or an educator. More generally, James is probably talking about people who have some responsibility over the care of souls, or over other people. So James starts off with a warning about this strictness. Why is that? Now he'll start to explain. It has something to do with speech. For all of us make many mistakes. Anyone who makes no mistakes in speaking is perfect, able to keep the whole body in check with a bridle. In other words, James seems to be saying that if anybody can just speak well, to never make a mistake, to never speak in a way that denigrates somebody else, to never lead people into a religious or spiritual harm of any kind, they're probably living a perfect life. Because what James is going to say is just how hard it is to control one's speech. And so he goes on, if we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we guide their whole bodies. Or look at ships, though they are so large that it takes strong winds to drive them, yet they are guided by a very small rudder wherever the will of the pilot directs. So also the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great exploits. In other words, we're talking about a relatively small part of your body, but one that has tremendous control. Just like if you can, get a bit inside of a horse's mouth, you can make it move a certain way. A very small rudder will move an incredibly large ship. So, James has got a metaphor here that he's using. These aren't metaphors that aren't, these are metaphors that are common in other kind of moralistic writings from the time. So James's basic point here is that the tongue can have a tremendous influence, that our speeches, that there's things that we say can cause change, can lead toward change. The shadow side of this comes then on this slide, where then James says, how great a forest is set ablaze by a small fire, something we're acutely aware of in this country, especially with a lot of the droughts in the West these days. And the tongue is a fire. So now the tongue has moved from being kind of a neutral metaphor, or maybe even a positive metaphor, to something a lot more dangerous, right? The tongue is this thing that's lit. It's an open flame. The tongue is placed among our members as a world of iniquity. In other words, in our bodies as a world of iniquity. It stains the whole body, sets on fire the cycle of nature, and is itself set on fire by hell. This turned bleak in a hurry, but again, warning what can happen, right, with careless speech. For every species of beast and bird, of reptile and sea creature can be tamed, and has been tamed by the human species, but no one can tame the tongue, a restless evil full of deadly poison. Interesting here now, right? So again, talking about the shadow side, James is saying humanity has been able to tame or to domesticate just about anything. This is probably overstatement. I think there are probably some species that we have not tamed, and certainly in James's time, many species that have not been tamed. But the point here is that we have capacity to bring a lot of things. Human beings have capacity to bring a lot of aspects of the natural world under our submission, for better or for worse. But James is saying that the tongue is finally untamable, right? Nobody can tame the tongue. Nobody's been able to successfully get humanity to stop sinning with its mouth, and stop the kind of moral problem that the tongue can cause. And then James calls it a restless evil, full of deadly poison. And it's almost this, James describes it as almost this outlier, like the human tongue is almost this outlier within all of creation. The rest of creation might have a particular kind of harmony, and humanity might be able to interact with creation in productive ways, and maybe even some salutary or positive ways. But the tongue is always causing trouble, and is always almost this, if not a blemish on creation, at least certainly a problematic aspect of it. James goes on, with it, or with our tongues, we bless the Lord and Father, speaking of God here, and with it we curse those who are made in the likeness of God. Maybe a vague allusion here back to Genesis chapter 1, where the author of Genesis describes humanity being made in God's own image. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. So this is something we talked about being double-tongued earlier. I think back in session 1, I said one of the things that the book of James hates is double-mindedness, or things that don't act according to what they are. So this is one of those things that really arouses the ire of the book of James, that from the same mouth, blessing and cursing can come. My brothers and sisters, this ought not to be so, right? This can't work. This isn't supposed to happen this way. Does a spring pour out from the same opening, both fresh and brackish water? Can a fig tree, my brothers and sisters, yield olives, or a grapevine figs? No more can salt water yield fresh. Again, James doesn't have a lot of room for ambiguity. Things for James tend to be either really good and beautiful and perfect, or really evil and despicable. That's part of the rhetoric of the book. I'm not so sure that James really imagines that you either live perfectly or you live in this horrific way. But what James is getting at here is the way in which speech is a problematic aspect of human existence. Just like earlier on in chapter 2, he talked about the importance of faith manifesting itself in good works, largely good works towards somebody else, works of obedience, sometimes works of building up faith, sometimes works of generosity and charity. But here it's this idea that the tongue can cause damage to people, that the same mouth that blesses God can curse a human being. In other words, what's going on here is it's not that James is saying that the solution to this is virtue. You might expect this from somebody whose primary interest was all about morals and moralisms, that James would say, look, the tongue is a hard thing to tame, and we need to work really hard to be better with our speech and to learn to bless and to not curse others. James doesn't even go that route. James describes this as some kind of, a restless evil full of deadly poison. In other words, it seems like even all the moral effort in the world can't finally make the tongue be perfect, can't finally prevent us from sinning with our words. It's not just about working harder. It's not just about self-control, not just about good manners. James seems to see some kind of a spiritual tug of war taking place here that plays itself out even within one's own body, one's own self. I don't think James is saying, I don't want you to hear from this that, speech is a bad thing, or that everybody should just keep their mouth shut. I'm not so sure that's what James is getting at, but what James is saying is that something about God's intended design has become polluted here, right? That the mouths that are made to bless God somehow end up cursing our fellow human beings. Now, we can talk about whether that's true or not. That might be an interesting discussion. But I think what's interesting to me, at least, is in a lot of ways, James is talking here about the power of language, not just the power of public speech, but about the ways in which we talk about ourselves, the ways in which we talk about our neighbors, the way in which we talk about God. And so it raises the question for me of language in particular. A commentator on the book of James, whom I like very much, a Roman Catholic biblical scholar named Luke Timothy Johnson, is trying to get at what makes this paragraph that I just read so important to James. And it's not just because James is worried that you might swear, or that you might call your neighbor a bad name or a jerk or something like that from time to time, but rather it's this idea that we have the capacity in ourselves to speak curses of another human being, of somebody else, made in God's image, which of course we can imagine all kinds of parallels in our own culture, in our own society. I don't know, I went back to 1960 here. You can certainly find images from 2022 that show ways in which we end up cursing our neighbors. We end up belittling other people, denying the full humanity of other folks. So here's a famous photo from when Ruby Bridges was the first student to integrate an elementary school in the state of Mississippi. So these reminders about speech and how heavy a thing speech is reminds me too of the legacy of Abraham Joshua Heschel, who might be a name that's familiar to some of you. Abraham Joshua Heschel was a rabbi who was a scholar, wrote some tremendous works on the biblical prophets in particular, but was also an important figure in the civil rights movement in the United States. Was a friend to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., marched with him on multiple occasions. Heschel, as remembered by his daughter in a collection of essays, had this to say about her father, and it's got a famous quote in here. So again, this is Susanna Heschel writing about her father. Words he often wrote are themselves sacred. Words are God's tool for creating the universe and our tools for bringing holiness or evil into the world. See how Heschel here is drawing on Genesis chapter 1, where God creates the world with speech, right? God speaks the world into existence in the description there. He, Heschel, used to remind us that the Holocaust did not begin with the building of crematoria, and Hitler did not come to power with tanks and guns. It all began with uttering evil words, with defamation, with language and propaganda. Words create worlds, he used to tell me when I was a child. They, or words, must be used very carefully. Some words, having been uttered, gain eternity and can never be withdrawn. The book of Proverbs reminds us, he wrote, that death and life are in the power of the tongue. I'm sure Heschel read the book of James sometimes, but obviously James was not part of his scripture, but might see similar things at work in the book of James. James certainly bears some resemblance to the Old Testament book of Proverbs as well. But that line, words create worlds, is a term that I've seen attributed to a number of authors. It's this idea that language creates reality, that the terms we use, the language we use, the way we speak governs how we interact with the world around us and the people around us. It's also a theological expression, right? Words create worlds. That's certainly true with Genesis 1, but they also do in our own lives. The terms we use to describe people, the ways in which we describe the world around us, has the power to shape perception. So in other words, take this back to the book of James. James isn't concerned, again, just with people, right, swearing too much, or taking the Lord's name in vain, or calling somebody a blockhead or something like that. I think James is deeply concerned about the way in which how we construe reality, how we speak about one another, how we think, how we describe the world, has tremendous power to do damage if we're not careful about that. What does this mean then? Well, this is, I'm going to put one of the discussion questions out here early, just for you to ponder. But how can that motivate each of us, this idea of the importance of words to do both good and harm? How does that motivate each of us to lift up the dignity of all individuals? How does it also encourage the church to find ways of speaking about God in ways that people, that the public will experience as liberating and life-giving. But what does this also say about listening? We quickly jump to speech because James has so much to say about the tongue. Westminster uses that expression that our community is a telling presence in the city, which seems to imply speech. But also James talks about the importance of listening. So that's something else I want to make sure that we consider. We'll come back to those questions when we get into small groups. But I wanted to unpack a little bit of that language, or that discussion about the tongue, about human speech, so we would see it as more than just moral scolding, or just more than, how you teach your children to get through life with their heads down or something like that. It can be read that way in a kind of in a way that can be kind of dismissive of the idea that anybody else has something to say. Certainly, I think some of the way in which we interact in the world is to amplify the voices of others. But James will always remind us of the way in which each of us has the capacity to, to wreak havoc, right? To do harm in the world through speech. So let me pause there. We're about 7:30, and that's halfway. So I want to just give a chance for some interaction, maybe discussion or questions or observations, complaints, all that talk about speech. You're probably, disinclined to say anything, but here's your opportunity if you want to. Go ahead and just feel free to unmute yourself. I see David, your hand's there. I can't see everybody at the same time though.
It's interesting. I read a news blurb today where they were attacking the nominee to the Supreme Court for the words that she's using. She refuses to use the term alien or illegal immigrant in all of her court decisions. There are people without citizenship. There are people without papers. There are people without documentation. And so she doesn't use a pejorative term at all, but she talks about them as people without papers, people without documentation. And this news article appeared on a Fox News, and they were insisting that the Republicans should block her nomination for that kind of talk.
It's a good illustration, right? I think it's a way in which words do create worlds. Words become politicized, and our terminology we use also becomes an identifier, doesn't it? There's certain terms that you can use for things that will reveal your politics, perhaps, or your theology.
And we can quickly say, oh, those people.
Right. Thanks for that.
Well, I'm struck with the language of poison and fire. I'm trying to think of how that is, in the longer biblical story. Has there been a shift somewhere? That piece about Heschel talking about Hitler, it just it strikes me that it was Hitler who said something like, "Learning is poison." I don't know if that's a quote, but you read the psalmist, and fire can be purifying. And I'm just struck with these images. I don't know, somehow they seem to kind of just knock me off my base here a bit. I'm wondering whose story is a story of poison. I'm not quite, I don't want to draw in Socrates, but I mean, it's like, it just doesn't seem so very good. There's a story of throwing stuff in the water when they're wandering in the wilderness, and they argue, and it's a bad place. And then I think somehow one of the prophets, or maybe it's a double story with Moses, they clear the water by throwing in a branch or something. But it's just like trying to get the big picture here. This is a this is tough to swallow.
It's I think a couple of things. One is there is a kind of an avalanche of metaphors that come in what we just read from James. And it is severe, right? The way in which James is saying, like he said, fire and poison, that it's not clear that James imagines there's any real hope for that. And as if what James is going to commend then is, so don't say anything. But I think I want to keep it in context that the chapter does begin with James talking about teachers. I think he is talking primarily about people who are in a position to influence the spiritual lives of others, so the religious commitments of others. Do you know what I mean? I don't think he's talking about all speech and all places and all kinds. But at the same time, I think James would probably say anybody's speech has the potential to bless or to curse. And we probably use our speech to end up cursing or diminishing people more often than we realize. But I do think it's probably that bigger context of kind of religious authority. I remember last week, James is so concerned about a religious community that's too eager to give preference to the powerful and the wealthy, and disinclined to give respect to the poor, those who are poor. And so I think in some ways this might connect to that James is afraid of a community that either through its spoken language, its confessions of faith, or through just its practices is, well, to use James's expression, is setting the world on fire, right? Is causing trouble, causing destruction through its ways of communicating. So is it severe? Absolutely. You know, the language of hell. But, and these are passages these are verses that can be pulled out of context. And like I said, can be used to silence people, or can make people feel like they've got nothing good to say, or their job is to sit and shut up and not have an opinion. I don't think that's what James is ultimately about here. So I would urge people not to hear it quite that way. I think we have to fit this in the bigger umbrella, right, of how do communities of faith exercise influence on the world in ways that correspond to the gospel? Because if they don't, then what they are doing is more destructive than helpful. Does that help maybe make it less terrifying? Or maybe it's more terrifying.
I wasn't so much, I mean, it was hard to get around the terrifying, and and contextualizing it in teachers and all that's good. But I was just, I mean, you've said the Old Testament story is God speaks the world into existence. And yeah, we have to make the distinction between God and us. And what better way to point it out than how we treat each other, which all seems very gospel oriented. But is it like it's been there all along? I mean, even the tree was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It wasn't poisonous to eat that fruit. I mean, I don't know. I mean, but is it always there? Is this just one of those realities that we're presented with by being in the world, the way the world is?
Yeah. Maybe, yeah. If James were a little bit longer, that might help. I think it's this idea that something that we've been created to do or to be isn't functioning the way it should. I imagine that James would say, a part of our body that enables us to give praise to God, like the tongue, right, or our capacity for speech and communication, that's supposed to be there to give blessing to God and maybe to bless our neighbor, is nevertheless something that we use in corrupted ways that actually bring cursing to other people or actually diminish other people. And so it's that idea of, for James, it's supposed to be like this. If you're a person of faith, you're supposed to live like this. If you believe this way, you're supposed to speak like this, but you're not, or you don't. And that just drives James crazy. It's a kind of, which again is part of when I say it's part of the rhetoric, this is part of the way the book tries to be persuasive. I don't think it's a book designed to give a lot of nuance, but
it's very persuasive.
Yeah, well, it got your attention, so there's also that.
I wanted to just add a thought on this, that when you talk about the church and James giving words authority, our church for so many centuries has been speaking almost solely in the male voice. And I've often wondered how, were I female, would I feel like this really is directed to me? Is there a place for me? How do I fit into this? I've had the experience as a lawyer over the last number of years of representing at various points in time 3 different orders of Catholic nuns. And these are absolutely extraordinary women who I've come to know through this process and the things they do. And yet, in order to be able to, some extent at least, run their own affairs, they've had to separate, in a sense, from the body of the rest of the church. And I just almost wonder if one doesn't look at James differently depending upon their gender and where it came from and how they feel about what the church has done with James' teaching over time.
Yeah, I'm not going to speak for the women in the group or in general, but I hope that might come out maybe in some small group discussion as well. I mean, but I appreciate you flagging it, that it's, and you're absolutely right. The church is, the history of Christian theology is primarily a male story, with the language that goes with that. So that reinforces that, right?
Matt, I had a question about the phrase about the tongue being set on fire by hell, Gehenna. Mostly hell is taken to be something one deals with after earthly life. This suggests that hell is reaching back into earthly life to some degree. Is that a any idea what the source of that is, or is that done elsewhere? I don't recall that being done anyplace else in the New Testament that I can cite, at least.
This idea of quote unquote hell having agency or doing things in this world, that's what you mean, Jim?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of another example as well. I don't want to, I wouldn't take this one verse and try to create a whole doctrine of hell out of it, because I think it's, again, the rhetoric is, he's trying to say that, the tongue is a fire. In fact, this is what kind of fire it is. It's hellfire. But you're right. It's the way in which that functions. I don't know if I'm comfortable like speculating too much beyond that, except to say that it might mean the same thing if James had said it's set on fire by the devil, or it's set on fire some other way.
Thanks.
I'll just point out that the word there is Gehenna, which is actually a Hebrew word that gets then just kind of loaned into Greek, which is what James was written in. And Gehenna was a valley outside of Jerusalem, essentially, that was, well, this would be a long tangent, but was known or is described in parts of the Old Testament as a place where some religious groups practice child sacrifice. And so the idea of the fires of Gehenna became kind of symbolic of about the worst kind of evil you could imagine. That's another class probably to go too much further into that, but I want to make sure we get back to James. I appreciate the conversation. We can hold some of these questions up and keep talking about them as well. And I also want to reiterate the way in which, James is primarily about the way speech can get you into trouble. And I do hope we get to talk about ways in which silence can get people into trouble sometimes as well, and how these verses have been used in ways that are not equitable in terms of, who gets commanded by them. But I want to move on then to the second part of the chapter. And before we move on, I want to speak really briefly about divine wisdom, because James will use that word wisdom occasionally in in the rest of chapter 3. And divine wisdom, that word wisdom has a lot of resonance in Jewish theological ways of thinking. It has resonance in some Old Testament texts, most notably in the book of Proverbs, that speaks about wisdom as a personified being, speaks about wisdom as a woman. The book of Proverbs has contrast between a woman of folly and the woman of wisdom, these two voices that cry out in the marketplace. Proverbs as well has its dualisms. But wisdom has a what's the word I want? I guess attraction even beyond Proverbs, where other Jewish writings talk about it as well. That wisdom is personified. In fact, this is from the Sistine Chapel. You see God there with the gray hair and the gray beard, with God's left arm around somebody who appears to be female, and some have suggested this is Michelangelo's way of writing wisdom into the creation story as told in the Sistine Chapel. Wisdom is perceived as not necessarily a second God, but wisdom is presented as kind of the first of all things that emanate from God, and wisdom is present at creation, and wisdom is present in the world and at loose in the world, and wisdom is a way in which God manifests God's own creative power among humanity. And wisdom is almost always portrayed when personified in Jewish texts in female terms as well. So I want to just look at two passages from a book called The Wisdom of Solomon. Again, this is not in the Protestant Bible or in Jewish Bibles. You will find it in some in Catholic and some Orthodox Bibles, but it was a Jewish text from, again, roughly 1 to 2 centuries prior to the time of Jesus and probably James. But this is the voice of Solomon speaking to God. With you is wisdom, she who knows your works and was present when you made the world. Right. So again, that's pretty far back in time. She understands what is pleasing in your sight and what is right according to your commandments. Send her forth. Again, this is a prayer. This is the voice of Solomon talking to God. Send her forth from the holy heavens and from the throne of your glory. Send her that she may labor at my side and that I may learn what is pleasing to you. For she knows and understands all things, and she will guide me wisely in my actions and guard me with her glory. This idea of divine wisdom being something that's not caught up in God's own self, but is, again, personified, an emanation, a manifestation of God's own self and God's own goodness. Another passage from earlier in the Wisdom of Solomon. I learned both what is secret, this is again Solomon's voice, what is secret and what is manifest. For wisdom, the fashioner of all things taught me, right? Wisdom is Solomon's teacher. There is in her a spirit that is intelligent, wholly unique, manifold, subtle, mobile, clear, unpolluted, distinct, invulnerable, loving the good, keen, irresistible, beneficent, humane, steadfast, sure, free from anxiety, all powerful, overseeing all, and penetrating through all spirits. They're intelligent, pure, and altogether subtle. Woo! It's the author needed an editor. For wisdom is more mobile than any motion. Because of her pureness, she pervades and penetrates all things. For she is a breath of the power of God and a pure emanation of the glory of the Almighty. Therefore, nothing defiled gains entrance into her. For she is a reflection of eternal light, a spotless mirror of the working of God, and an image of God's goodness. Although she is but one, she can do all things, and while remaining in herself, she renews all things. In every generation, she passes into holy souls and makes them friends of God and prophets. For God loves nothing so much as the person who lives with wisdom. Now, James isn't quoting from Wisdom of Solomon, but James will be talking about wisdom. And there are other Jewish writings that do talk about wisdom in similar ways to this. But notice the kind of almost inseparability between God and God's wisdom. Notice as well the way in which wisdom is out and about, in the world and passing into people. That the second to last line there, makes them friends of God. That was a term we saw last week in James chapter 2 about Abraham becoming a friend of God. So just to note, if James's audience is Jewish, or at least has some familiarity with Jewish writings and Jewish teachings about wisdom, a lot of what we're going to see will have some resonance with James's audience. So wisdom then is more than just common sense or accumulated knowledge, right? We tend to think of wisdom as things that come through experience or knowledge that you can gain if you're just patient enough. In Jewish ways of talking, these ancient Jewish ways of talking about wisdom, wisdom, it or she, is a personified manifestation or an expression of God. So what does that mean? Well, when James starts off in verse 13, who is wise and understanding among you? Show by your good life that your works are done with gentleness born of wisdom. So there's wisdom, right? Mention of being wise, and then a mention here of wisdom, this idea of gentleness that's born of wisdom. Is this the opposite of destructive speech? It's not entirely clear about that. It seems that the theme is a little bit different, but James is here commending gentleness. But here comes the contrast. If you have bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, don't be boastful and false to the truth. So here's the opposite then of this gentleness born of wisdom, is envy and ambition. Both of those terms, I think, tie into viewing a world with through the lens of competition or the need to dominate your rivals or somebody else. So here's the contrast: gentleness versus this more competitive notion of envy and ambition. Such wisdom, right, that so-called wisdom, you might say, doesn't come down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, devilish. For where there is envy and selfish ambition, there will also be disorder and wickedness of every kind. Once again, we're seeing James's dualisms here, right? Pushing way out toward the two poles. But the wisdom from above, right? Divine wisdom, notice the up and down, above and below imagery here. The wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without a trace of partiality or hypocrisy. Again, James has already talked a bit about favoritism and hypocrisy and the idea of doing good works. So there's a connection here to what we've seen already in the letter. James is commending a kind of wisdom, again, not just knowledge, but a kind of participation in God's creative goodness in the world. James is calling for participation in that is contrasted to a kind of wisdom or a kind of logic or a way of living that's built around envy and selfish ambition. Those words are kind of rough, right? Envy and selfish ambition, we kind of ascribe those terms to villains sometime, but those are pretty common, I think, of ways in which envy and ambition get in the way of my life on a regular basis. And then James ends with, and a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace for those who make peace. The kind of wisdom James is, or the kind of wisdom that James is commending is one that makes itself known through peace, peacemaking, through gentleness, this idea of being willing to yield to another. By contrast, that selfish ambition, to me, that sounds like what it means to live in a world where everything is limited goods, right? Where there can't possibly be enough for everybody. And so I'm going to have to fight for what's mine. Of course, there are some limited goods in this world, but you know what I mean? I'm talking about a kind of way of thinking that every time somebody else is gaining, I somehow have to lose, or vice versa. And that's the end of chapter 3. So I'll say this and then stop sharing my screen. But I think part of what's going on in chapter 3 is it's raising this question of what manner of living or what view of life correspond to the kind of faith that the book of James is commending. Remember in chapter 2, for James, faith manifests itself in some way in our deeds, in our good deeds. How does that live itself out? Is that through moral effort? Is that through just believing harder? I think for James, it's about this notion of being in touch with God's wisdom, with learning from God's wisdom, with dwelling with God's wisdom, which is a creative power in the world. It's a peacemaking power in the world. And so we might ask this, right, with regard to the question of speech and the tongue and the damage we can do to our neighbor, we might want to ask the question, what is it that keeps us oriented to each person's God-given dignity? What is it that makes that work either easier to do or harder to do? How is that something we do as individuals as we think about how we speak to or about other people? But also, how is it something that a community does? Right? How does a community think together about how it communicates and how we shape our views of the world through our language? And then also, what view of the world urges us to choose peace over zero-sum competition? What I mean by that, by zero-sum, right, is this idea that there always has to be a winner and always has to be a loser, that this notion of envy and ambition and competition is one way of viewing the world. And some people might want to talk about ways in which competition is actually good for humanity. We have to define what we mean by competition there. But what does it mean to think about a way of viewing the world that's peaceful and that is gentle and that is creative as well? And what makes that kind of wisdom divine would be an interesting question. So I have small group questions. I'm putting those on the screen. Look at this. I even did sub questions this time, but that's for people who are watching on the video. They might want to pause it so they can see those. I'll circulate those questions in a minute. Don't be afraid by the A, B, and C. It'll all be okay. But we've got a couple of minutes here in a larger group. Wonder of wonders. I'm not going to talk the entire hour, but are there things that you see in the text that you want to lift up or questions or comments? Yeah, I see Ken Huskins.
Yeah, Matt, as you described wisdom, in my mind, I kept hearing Holy Spirit. Yeah. And I'm wondering if they're one and the same, or whether you can help us to understand how we might think of them differently.
Yeah, that's a good question. Sometimes people, when we talk about Old Testament wisdom, sometimes people hear Jesus because of the opening verses to the Gospel of John that talk about the Word becoming flesh and dwelling among us, and the Word being all things were created through the Word as well, and that the idea of word could almost easily be translated wisdom, and it would sound a lot like some of those texts. But you're right that in some ways the Spirit is similar to that in the idea of indwelling, an idea of God being present, not just among us, but literally within us, to use that kind of language. And the Spirit not being like a messenger from God, but actually being God, similar to wisdom. That divine wisdom isn't necessarily a separate thing. It appears to be a manifestation of the same God. That's kind of tricky because, Judaism is a little bit more committed to this idea of the oneness to God in a particular way. But those wisdom traditions are all over the place in a lot of Jewish texts and some Jewish spirituality as well. So I think what I'm saying is kind of agreeing with you in some ways, this idea of a God who's not a distant figure that we study from afar, but actually a God who shares the same space with us and even shares our own embodied existence with us.
And teaches.
And teaches too, absolutely. I wrote 3 questions tonight, and they are, the third one is the same one as last week. So, you might feel you're not getting your money's worth in that, because it's a repeated question. But that first question there is just simply, how does James teach us about the power of speech to to do three things, and it should be A, B, and C, but I put B, B, and C because I made a mistake. So those are just different kind of ways in which James talks about speech. And then James chapter 2 is, what is it about gentleness and peaceableness that's heavenly? That's something that God would commend. So if you're going to stick around for the small groups, great. Those are the questions. If you're going to head out early, I hope you'll spend a little bit of time looking at those.